The knock came just as the old clock on the wall struck 9, shattering the quiet in a way that made Daniel Carter's heart jolt against his ribs. Christmas Eve had always been silent in his small, dimly lit house, but this year it felt heavier than usual. Snow fell softly outside the window, covering the sleepy street in a blanket of white, while inside, the only light came from a small Christmas tree glowing gently in the corner. Daniel had just finished placing a tiny wrapped toy beneath it for his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, who had already fallen asleep on the couch with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Life had not been kind to Daniel in the past few years. Losing his wife in a sudden accident had turned his world upside down, leaving him to learn how to be both father and mother to a little girl who still asked when Mommy would come home. Christmas used to be the happiest time of the year for their family, but now it felt more like a quiet reminder of what had been lost. And yet, despite the sadness that lingered in the air, Daniel tried his best. He worked long hours fixing cars at a local garage, came home exhausted, and still found the energy to help Lily with her schoolwork, cook dinner, and read bedtime stories. Every small smile from his daughter felt like a tiny victory against the loneliness. But that knock on the door that night didn't belong to the peaceful silence of Christmas Eve. It came again, louder this time. Daniel froze. Nobody ever visited this late, especially not on Christmas Eve. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, assuming it might be a mistake or someone knocking on the wrong house. But something about the urgency in the sound made him walk slowly toward the door. The hallway felt colder with every step. When he opened the door, the sight before him made his breath catch. Standing in the doorway was a young woman, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks from the falling snow, and she held the trembling hand of a small child standing beside her. The little girl looked no older than 4, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Neither of them looked like they belonged out in the cold. For a moment, none of them moved. The woman looked as if she had reached the very end of her strength just standing there. Daniel's first instinct was caution. Life had taught him to be careful, especially when Lily was involved. But there was something about the woman's expression, something broken and desperate, that made it impossible for him to close the door. If you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, take a moment right now to like the video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of the power of humanity. The woman finally found the courage to explain why she was there. Her name was Sarah, and she had nowhere else to go. Daniel listened as she struggled to tell her story through tears. She had left a dangerous situation earlier that night after months of living in fear. The man she had trusted had slowly become someone cruel and unpredictable, and tonight things had gone too far. She grabbed her daughter Emma and ran without even packing a bag. The problem was that she didn't know where to run. Her phone battery had died hours ago. The snowstorm had worsened, buses had stopped running, and every shelter she tried was already full for the night. By the time she reached Daniel Street, she was nearly frozen and completely out of hope. She knocked on the first house that had its lights on. Daniel stood silently for a long moment, absorbing everything she had said. He looked down at the small girl clutching Sarah's hand. Emma's cheeks were red from the cold, and her tiny fingers were shaking. Something deep inside Daniel stirred. He remembered another cold night years ago when he had sat in a hospital hallway after losing his wife, feeling like the entire world had collapsed. A stranger had sat beside him then, offering quiet comfort when he needed it most. Sometimes kindness came from unexpected places. And sometimes it was your turn to be that kindness for someone else. Daniel stepped aside and opened the door wider. The warmth of the house spilled out into the snowy night as Sarah and Emma slowly stepped inside. The change in temperature alone made Sarah's shoulders sag with relief. Daniel brought them towels, made hot chocolate, and gave Emma one of Lily's old sweaters that was far too big for her, but warm enough to stop her shivering. When Lily woke up and saw another little girl sitting near the Christmas tree, her confusion quickly turned into curiosity. Children had a way of accepting things without the complicated doubts adults carried. Within minutes, Lily was showing Emma her toys. The house, which had felt lonely for so long, suddenly felt alive again. For the first time that night, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. Daniel could see how exhausted she was, how close she had come to completely giving up. He set up the small guest room that had remained untouched since his wife passed away. It felt strange opening that door again. Memories rushed back like waves. But somehow, letting someone else rest there made the room feel less like a painful memory and more like something meaningful again. Outside, the snowstorm grew heavier. Inside, the little house glowed with warmth. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep near the Christmas tree, Daniel sat quietly by the window. He thought about how different this Christmas Eve had turned out. Just hours ago, he had believed it would be another quiet night filled with bittersweet memories. Instead, life had delivered something unexpected. Two strangers had walked into his life at the exact moment they needed help the most. And somehow, helping them made the emptiness inside him feel a little smaller. The next morning, Christmas arrived with sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. Wow! Lily and Emma woke up early, their laughter echoing through the house as they discovered the small pile of presents beneath the tree. Daniel had not planned for extra gifts, but Lily insisted on sharing every toy she received. Watching them play together filled the room with a joy Daniel hadn't felt in years. Sarah stood quietly in the kitchen doorway, tears welling in her eyes again. But this time they weren't from fear. They were from gratitude. She had expected judgment. She had expected rejection. Instead, she found kindness. Over breakfast, Daniel helped her make a plan. He called a local support center he knew about through a friend at the garage. By the afternoon, they arranged safe housing for Sarah and Emma, where they could begin rebuilding their lives. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was all someone needed. Before leaving, Emma hugged Lily tightly. The two girls had formed a bond in less than a day that felt surprisingly deep. Sarah thanked Daniel more times than he could count, but Daniel simply shook his head. Helping them hadn't felt like a burden. It had felt like a reminder. A reminder that even when life seemed quiet and lonely, it still had ways of bringing people together. Just before the story reaches its final moments, I have a special request for you. In the comments below, write the word "a kindness" if you believe even the smallest act of compassion can change someone's life forever, because sometimes it truly can. As Sarah and Emma walked down the snowy path that afternoon, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace watching them go. Not because their story was over, but because it was beginning again, and in a quiet way so was his. For years he had focused only on surviving each day for Lily, but now he realized something important. His life wasn't just about surviving. It could still be about helping others, building connections, and creating moments of light in someone else's darkness. That night, as Lily fell asleep after a long Christmas day, she asked Daniel something simple. She wondered if Emma would visit again someday. Daniel smiled and told her he hoped so, because deep down he believed they would. The house felt quiet again once Lily drifted off. But this time, the silence felt different. It no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. Because sometimes a single knock on the door can change everything. And sometimes the greatest Christmas gifts are not the ones wrapped beneath a tree. They are the unexpected moments when compassion opens a door and two lives cross paths exactly when they need each other most. Before you go, if this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who believes in the power of kindness. Comment your thoughts below. And subscribe to the channel so more people can hear stories that remind us humanity is still alive in this world. Because somewhere tonight, someone may be standing in the cold, hoping that one door will open. Snow continued falling through the night, quietly covering the small neighborhood in a thick white blanket. By the time the sun rose the morning after Christmas, Daniel Carter stood by the window holding a warm cup of coffee, watching the empty street outside his house. Everything looked peaceful again, almost as if the previous night had been a dream. But it hadn't been. Just hours earlier, two strangers had walked into his life and changed something inside him. For years after losing his wife, Daniel had built invisible walls around his heart. He focused on work, raising Lily, and getting through each day. It wasn't that he had stopped believing in kindness. It was just that life had become smaller, quieter, and carefully protected from any new pain. Yet that single knock on Christmas Eve had cracked those walls open. The house still carried small traces of Sarah and Emma's presence. The oversized sweater Emma had worn was folded neatly on the chair. Two mugs from the hot chocolate they shared still sat by the sink. And Lily's toys were scattered everywhere after her late-night adventure playing with her new friend. Daniel smiled faintly as he picked up the small stuffed rabbit Lily had left on the floor. Life felt different, not dramatically, but enough. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Lily walked through the snow-covered park near their home. The air was cold and crisp, but the sky was clear. Lily kept talking about Emma, excitedly describing all the games they had played together the night before. Children had a beautiful way of forming friendships without worrying about tomorrow. To Lily, Emma wasn't a stranger who had arrived during a snowstorm. She was simply a friend, and friends always came back. Daniel listened quietly as his daughter spoke, wondering what the future would hold for Sarah and Emma. The support center had promised to help them find temporary housing and resources, but rebuilding a life after escaping something painful was never easy. Still, he hoped they would be okay. Days turned into weeks. Winter slowly began loosening its grip on the town. Snow melted, streets grew busy again, and life returned to its usual routine. Daniel went back to working long days at the garage, fixing engines and changing tires, while Lily returned to school. But every once in a while, Daniel caught himself glancing at the front door, remembering that night, remembering the knock, and wondering how Sarah and Emma were doing. One evening in late January, as Daniel closed the garage for the day, his phone rang. He almost ignored it. But something made him answer. It was Sarah. For a moment, Daniel was speechless. Her voice sounded stronger than it had on Christmas Eve. There was still a hint of emotion behind her words, but now it was mixed with something new, hope. She explained that the support center had helped her find a small apartment in another part of the city. Emma had started attending a nearby preschool, and Sarah had found a part-time job at a local bakery. Things weren't perfect, but they were safe, and that meant everything. Daniel felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest as she spoke. Sometimes when you help someone, you never know what happens afterward. But hearing that their lives were slowly improving made that Christmas Eve decision feel even more meaningful. Sarah paused before saying something else. Emma still talked about Lily almost every day. She asked if they could visit sometime. Daniel looked over at Lily sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework. A quiet smile appeared on his face. He said yes. The following weekend, Sarah and Emma came to visit. The moment Lily opened the door and saw Emma standing there, the two girls ran toward each other like they had known each other for years instead of weeks. Their laughter filled the house instantly. Daniel and Sarah stood in the doorway watching them, both smiling quietly. The house no longer felt like the lonely place it had been for so long. Over the next few months, something beautiful began to grow. Sarah visited often. Sometimes she brought fresh bread from the bakery where she worked. Other times they simply shared dinner and talked while the girls played. Slowly the weight Sarah had carried in her eyes began fading. She laughed more, she smiled more, and Emma began looking like a carefree little girl again instead of a frightened child standing in the snow. Daniel noticed something else too. For the first time since losing his wife, he felt comfortable letting someone into his life again. Not because he was trying to replace what he had lost, but because life had quietly reminded him that love and kindness didn't have limits. They could grow in new directions. Spring arrived, bringing warmer days and blooming flowers. Lily and Emma spent countless afternoons running through the park, chasing butterflies and inventing games only children could understand. Watching them together often made Daniel reflect on that snowy Christmas Eve. How fragile the moment had been. How easily he could have chosen not to open the door. But sometimes the smallest decisions shape the biggest changes. One evening in early summer, the four of them sat outside in Daniel's backyard sharing a simple dinner under the fading sunlight. The girls were giggling near the fence, trying to catch fireflies. Sarah looked around quietly before speaking. She admitted something she had never said before. That night on Christmas Eve, when she knocked on Daniel's door, she had been moments away from completely losing hope. She had believed the world had no kindness left for her. But Daniel opening that door had changed everything. Not just for one night, for the rest of her life. Daniel listened carefully. Then he shook his head gently. Because in truth, she had changed something for him too. Before she arrived, Christmas had been a quiet reminder of loss, but now it had become something else entirely. A memory of the night two strangers reminded him that life still had unexpected miracles. If this story has touched your heart so far, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. And before we reach the final moments of this story, here is a special request. In the comments below, write the words "open the door" if you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire future. Because sometimes it truly can. That winter, nearly 1 year after that unforgettable Christmas Eve, the Carter house looked very different. The Christmas tree stood taller, more decorations filled the room, and the sound of laughter echoed through every corner. Lily and Emma were decorating cookies at the kitchen table while Daniel and Sarah stood nearby, watching them with quiet smiles. Outside, snow had started falling again. The clock on the wall slowly ticked toward 9. Daniel noticed the time and chuckled softly. Exactly 1 year since that knock. Sarah followed his gaze to the clock and smiled too. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to, because both of them understood something deeply now. Life could break people. It could take away things they loved. It could leave them feeling lost in the cold. But sometimes, when everything seemed darkest, hope arrived in the simplest form. A knock on a door, a moment of kindness, a stranger willing to open their home. And that small moment could ripple forward, changing lives in ways no one could ever predict. As the girls laughed loudly in the kitchen, Daniel realized something he hadn't felt in years. His house wasn't just full, his heart was too. And if this story reminded you that kindness still exists in the world, please take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who needs hope today, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there tonight, someone might be standing in the cold hoping that one door will open. And maybe, just maybe, it